Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Fiona DiDomenico, and welcome to our webinar on vendor management in a COVID-19 world. Wanted to thank you for taking the time to join us today. And for those of you that are current Castle clients, welcome back if you've been to our webinars before. And for those of you that are new, thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you. And for those of you that don't know Castle, I'll tell you just a little bit about us. We are a Florida-based management company. We manage over 350 associations across the state of Florida and in Texas. And we specialize in communities where we can put a team on site. Many of our communities have large-scale amenities. They might have full food and beverage facilities. And really our job is to make your job simple. Our job is to execute on the vision that the board has for the community, and we would love to help you out with that. So feel free to reach out. I'm going to be the moderator today. I'm going to try to walk us through. We received quite a few questions. For those of you that sent in questions, thank you. We're going to kind of walk through the presentation and answer most of the questions that we got. We're going to try to stay on point for you, keeping everything related to vendor management. And as you have questions or thoughts that come up, as Rose said, please feel free to chat those in. You're going to continue to see me look down on the screen. I'm looking at your questions as they're coming in, and I'll try to get our experts to give us some great answers. So with that, I wanted to turn it over and introduce Matt Fernandez. Matt, welcome, and tell us about yourself and about VendorSmart.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. So my name is Matt Fernandez. I'm the Vice President of Client Engagement at VendorSmart. And what we do at VendorSmart is a few different things, but we connect community managers to certified and compliant vendors. So we provide a variety of services to community management companies and vendors, some of which being vetting all of the insurance and compliance documents that a vendor would need prior to stepping foot on your property and doing any work. We do that on an ongoing basis for the management company. We've also got a vendor directory. We've got an RFP, request for proposal tool that allows managers to really do their job in a seamless way and also include the vendor in part of that process. So really, vendor management A to Z is what we provide at VendorSmart. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. And I also want to introduce Alex Delgado. Alex, welcome.
Hi, guys. Thank you. So I'm the president of VendorSmart, and I do what Matt tells me.
Excellent. Well, we've got two pros here. We appreciate you guys being here, and in all sincerity, it's a great technology. We use it guys at Castle, and we've got some real world experiences that we can talk about. But why don't we, Rose, jump to the next slide, and we'll kind of walk through some of the topics here. So Matt, we talked about, what vendor management is, but maybe expand a little bit about that and kind of walk us through, the process.
Sure. So vendor management is, it means having a set standard and process for a few different things related to working with vendors. So the first is finding vendors, right? So you want to use reputable tools like a VendorSmart who've already pre-vetted vendors and done the busy work for you. There's Google, there's Yelp, right? So you want to have a standard set of process of how to find those vendors. The second is a standard process for vetting those vendors and their insurance and their licensing. So what I mean by vetting is every vendor requires a standard set of documents prior to stepping foot on property and rendering services, right? So just an example, a few of those documents are a W-9, certificate of liability insurance, workers' comp, maybe some sort of licensing. And then if you have jobs that are maybe larger, more specific, you may have certain specific licensing that may be catered to just that type of job. So having a process to which you vet those documents and then you vet them on an ongoing basis, right? So vendors, even if you've worked with them for a few years, vendors have turnover. Vendors may cancel or change their insurance without notifying you. So you want to make sure that you have a process in place to catch those things and to keep you abreast of those changes that are made. And VendorSmart is a tool for that, and there are management companies that have their own internal processes. And then the last component to vendor management is maintaining that relationship on an ongoing basis, right? So it's not enough to just vet those documents and vet that vendor once at the onset, you want to make sure that you're doing this on an ongoing basis. You want to be evaluating the performance of these vendors, right? So having conversations with either colleagues at your company or colleagues in the industry who have maybe worked with that vendor in the past. So making sure that they're, one, performing at the level that they should be, and then having a process in place to where if they're not, being able to make a change. So just to recap vendor management. So finding vendors in a certain way, vetting them, and then evaluating the performance and maintaining that relationship on an ongoing basis. And like I said, there is software to help with this, or management companies have internal processes, but you want to make sure from a vendor management perspective, you're covering at least those 3 points, A to Z.
Yeah, it's a great point. And in the old days, right, we used to do all of that manually. So the property manager on the property would have to literally, you know, have a paper file. They'd have to be chasing down, you know, the vendor. So all of my board members out there, you know how challenging it is in you know, today's day and age just to get, you know, 3 bids and to go through the bidding process. And then when you finally selected, you know, the vendor, in the old days, the manager had to make sure, of course, they were, you know, licensed, insured, and follow up on that prior to them starting. So now what we like to do is have it all, you know, electronic through a vendor like VendorSmart, where it literally, when the manager goes out to bid, so let's say you have a project you want to redo the pool deck, for example. The manager can go in, they can type in, for example, you know, what the vendor is that they're looking for. If it's a pool vendor, construction, it could be a roof vendor. They can say, I want a vendor who's within, you know, 50 miles of my zip code. I want someone who's, you know, completely vetted, and I would like to see the reviews on that particular vendor. So kind of like an Angie's List per se. Again, in the old days, they'd have to call every manager up. Have you used this vendor? Have you used that vendor? But now they can actually see it right there live, and it saves a ton of time, which is nice.
Sure, and just to add a COVID-19 point to that, there is also something to be said about keeping the relationship with the vendor ongoing. So if you work with great vendors, it's very difficult, as Fiona mentioned, to find those great vendors. But once you find them, even if you don't work with a vendor regularly, if it's a service that you'll need to work with at least once or twice a year, make sure you keep those relationships touch points, because one of the things that we found during COVID-19 is that there were a bunch of our customers that didn't have true relationships with vendors. And so when it came time to find someone to do disinfection or to buy masks, they couldn't find them because there was no stock. They didn't have true relationships with vendors that could help them. They were helping others instead. So that vendor relationship is a two-way street. It's not just vetting them, but you also want to make sure they like you and that they want to work with you.
Yeah, it's a great point, Alex. And we had a question that was submitted, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, but essentially the question was, you know, how do we communicate with the vendors if we don't have a guarded point of entry? So if you're in like a tower, for example, or a gated community, you know, you're able to control the vendor before they actually come onto the property because they have to go through a guard gate, for example. But what if they don't? And I think that, Alex, speaks to your point, is if you've got a relationship with those vendors, you know, we're communicating with the vendors on a regular basis by having a vendor file and being able to, you know, click a button and out comes all of the vendors for your particular property. Sure. And then we can email them, we can snail mail them, we can phone them, you know, whatever it might be. But being able to have that in an organized fashion is extremely helpful.
Certainly.
So then one of the questions we had was, how does proper vendor management mitigate the cost of a vendor having an accident while working on a project?
So I think it's important to remember that one of the biggest things, and Alex has touched on it, I've touched on it, is hiring great vendors, right? So one of the things that great vendors do is take safety seriously. So you want to make sure that the first things first, you're hiring vendors that are reputable, that have done projects like this before in the past, that can prove that, right? That can actually give you references and show you the quality of their work that they've done in the past. So a great vendor is going to be able to provide this to you. And in addition to that, be properly insured, right? So accidents are going to happen, whether you have the best vendor in the world or not. Accidents just happen, right? So because of that, we want to take as many steps as possible to mitigate as much risk as we can prior to that work being accomplished. So from the smallest vendor to the largest vendor, everybody should have liability insurance, for example, right? So oftentimes we hear, I'll have conversations with boards and they'll say, oh, well, we've been working with that vendor for years and he's just one guy. So, we know he doesn't have insurance, but that's okay. We know him and we trust him. So it's great that you do have that relationship, but it's super important from a risk perspective that you cover yourself and make sure that that vendor does have the appropriate level of insurance, whether it's one person or 10 people. In addition to that, so a handyman, right? So we hear a lot, well, it's just one person, they don't need workers' comp. What we recommend is to not really take that for an answer. You want to first consult with your attorney or insurance agent, make sure that it really is the case and not just take the vendor's word for it. Especially if they're a small vendor, they're cognizant of costs, right? So they're going to do anything they can to keep their costs low. But from a risk perspective, again, you want to make sure that you are completely covered and you're not just taking their word for it. So it may be beneficial to take that extra step and to make sure that they do have workers' comp and make sure that they do have the appropriate level of liability insurance. So, and then the insurance coverages range by project size, right? So if I'm just doing maintenance or changing out some light bulbs, that's maybe one level of insurance. And if I'm bringing on 10 guys to the site and doing major construction, that's a completely different level of insurance. So to answer the question in a concise way, you want to make sure that your insurance or that your vendors have the appropriate insurance and you're not just taking their word for it, you're actually validating it, you're verifying it. And if you need to seek additional counsel with your attorney or insurance agents, do that. Take that extra step because it will pay off in the long run.
Yeah, and Matt, it's a great point. I've had this conversation with many of, when we take on new accounts, occasionally we'll find this in the process. Exactly what you said is they've been working with, Billy Bob for literally 20 years, and they don't want to offend him by saying, hey, you don't have insurance. And I try to get boards to realize it's not only to protect, right, the association from a potential liability. Gosh forbid, right? I mean, things happen, accidents happen. That's why they're called accidents. And if something tragic were to happen to that vendor while on your property, quite frankly, they'd be in a position where they wouldn't have any choice but to sue the association. And you want them to have insurance so that they're protected as well. So we approach it from a management standpoint. We train our managers. You're not going after the vendor with a lawsuit to say, gosh, you've been on property all this time without insurance. It's like, help us look. We help educate and get everybody. How can we solve, this problem so that everybody's protected? So again, one of the questions that came in was, having these conversations with your vendors and not offending them, how do we keep that good relationship going? And I think Alex touched on it as well, which is, we're all in this together, right? We're partners, we're all in this together. We all want what's best for the community and for each other. It needs to be a win-win. So when you take that approach with the vendor, it's a much different conversation than, hey, you don't have insurance type of thing.
Sure. And to add some data points to this, we work with thousands of communities across the country. And so we know that on average, a community is going to have about 5 contracted vendors. And clearly there's some that have 20 and there's some that have 1, but the average is about 5. But the average association works with 100 vendors per year. And it doesn't feel that way because it's a one-off job here and a one-off job there. But the reality is that managers tend to do a very good job of vetting contracted vendors because they work with them regularly. On the other hand, both boards and managers sometimes don't do as good a job for the one-off vendors. And likely it's because it's a very small job. They don't want to make the vendor pay for insurance that they don't have or something to that effect. But those vendors pose the greatest risk to the association. Even in numbers, they pose the greatest risk. But also, a vendor who is more sophisticated and does larger contracts is almost guaranteed to have insurance because they have to cover themselves. A one-off handy person with the greatest intentions and the greatest service can still have an accident. And if they don't have liability insurance, that will put the association at risk. And to ease you on thinking that this is a burden for the vendors, insurance is almost always priced based on business size. And so a one-off person isn't going to pay a lot of money. Like oftentimes you can pay for both liability insurance policy and workers' comp policy with 1 or 2 jobs. So these guys should really be carrying insurance because it isn't very costly, but they may not know that. And so if they don't, then so companies like us can help them find insurance agents that can help them get very cost-effective insurance that can even be financed, so there's no financial burden. So we can provide help to the vendors in this area.
Great points, Alex. So a couple of questions have come in. I'm going to take a second to try to look at these. One is from Michael. He says, must any vendor doing work on private property in an HOA be required to have insurance since the homeowner has insurance? So I think the question is more if you're asking if you're hiring a vendor to come work on your private home within an HOA. And certainly our recommendation would be yes, but does the association have the ability to say they can't come on property to work in your home? Typically, no. However, if it's a condominium, it's a different scenario. So normally in a condo or depending on the association structure, if the vendor is going to be doing work or crossing a common area type scenario, then absolutely yes. They would need to. And the reason for that is, especially if you're in like a condo situation where they're coming, maybe they're using the service elevator, for example, right? So they're coming across association property. They could be, cutting into walls that could have an effect on your neighbors, things like that. So that is why insurance is required.
Yeah, something as simple as hanging a painting, guys. We had a situation where somebody drilled a hole into the wall to hang up a large painting and pierced the fire suppression system. And so something very simple that a homeowner thinks is a no-brainer could very easily be a very costly accident.
Yeah, and one of the other questions that I'm just looking at, it kind of leads into this, and it says, are there protocols available for contractors accessing a work site by moving through the public areas? And so again, I think that's probably a condo related question. And yes, absolutely. So I'll make a note for my team to reach out and we can circulate that. It varies depending on the actual association, what the setup is of the association. So again, some associations have like a loading dock area that is specific. There's a specific desk or gate that the vendor must go through, and a specific person or protocol for them to actually check in with that association. But we can certainly pass along some, basic guidelines that would help you build that for your own association. Happy to do that. A couple of other questions that came in is talking about masks, and must vendors wear face masks at all times? So that's obviously a COVID-related question. So again, I can tell you based from depending on where you are, what county you're in or city you're in, there are certain restrictions for buildings. And then certain associations have also adopted their own policies. So as a sort of general rule, you want to check with your association council before you put that rule into place. But the simple answer is yes, absolutely. The association can document, adopt a policy and require that masks be worn by the vendors. And then, how would you enforce that? Just like you would enforce, for example, when a vendor comes in, if they're going to pull up, let's say, someone's redoing their bathroom, right? And they have a whole bunch of debris. They're going to have sinks. They're going to have tile that they're throwing away. That can't all just be disposed in the association's dumpster. It should be hauled away. So there are ways that management can follow up on those things and, have policies in place to enforce. Okay, next questions. Let's see. What other costs can vendor management diminish? Alex or Matt, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So one area that proper vendor management doesn't quite isn't quite seen because it's behind the scenes is that we're always going to go back to this idea of finding the right vendor first is the best scenario for every single problem that you have in a vendor management position. So cost overruns is almost always the biggest expense when it comes to vendors. It's not liability because of an accident or anything like that. Like almost all larger projects have cost overruns, have delays, have change orders. So the better the vendor, the less of that you're going to get. And so the biggest cost mitigation of doing true management is having less of an unbudgeted line essentially for a project. So if there are delays for a project that requires multiple vendors, then one vendor can cause delays for the other vendors. And so those other vendors are still charging or they still have to pay their employees. So those could be overruns that the client has to take up. That is really the biggest thing that true vendor management saves you from doing. The insurance is a very important piece, but it is not where the biggest cost to a client comes from working with vendors on projects.
And it's a great point, Alex, because again, one of the benefits to having a system like this for vendors where managers can go in and see what other property managers have used this particular vendor. And we ask the managers to rate the vendors after they've used the vendor. And they can put comments in, you know, Billy Bob did a great job, or Billy Bob never showed up once on time, right? Whatever it might be. And so again, that saves the manager time, and certainly they still can call and speak to the other property manager who used that particular vendor, but it gives them a sense of, you know, was this a really smooth transaction with this vendor, or were there some issues, or were there questions that you know, maybe should have asked when you did the RFP that you didn't ask? So there's a lot of information that the managers can put into the system that really helps the other property managers.
Sure.
Matt, you look like you were going to say something there.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Fiona. So just to sort of expand on that, it sounds silly and it sounds basic, but really verifying references is so important and really often goes overlooked. And just to tie that back to COVID, you know, one of the important things to do is to make sure that what the services that the vendors are offering is something that they actually do, right? So what we're seeing at VendorSmart is in the past few months that COVID-19 has been, you know, impacting our lives, all of a sudden we're seeing vendors now doing sanitation and cleaning services that have never done that in the past. So you want to really make sure, and you want to do a deep dive to make sure, is this vendor, is this what they were doing 2 years ago? Or is this something that they started 2 months ago, right? Because that can greatly impact the quality of their work, the knowledge of what it is they're doing. So you really want to make sure that, especially in today's environment, that you're working with a vendor who can truly do that job and is not just doing it because it's, you know, a fad or it's because that's what the need is now. So really verifying references is, again, very basic, but something that often goes overlooked. Or maybe you'll get one reference, but it's always good to get multiple sources from managers that have worked with them in the past, or previous clients that have worked with that vendor in the past.
And
yeah,
within the project scope that you're working on, right? So not just any reference, but a reference that has done a job that's similar to the one that you're looking for.
Yep.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that too. Again, since, you know, being in a COVID environment, I think a great question to ask, you know, when you're talking to the vendors or to the references is, when did they work on your project, right? Was it before COVID? Was it after COVID? Was it like last week? Because things do change, and we have some, you know, some great companies. You're seeing it in the news every day that are, you know, filing bankruptcy, and these are big firms. So COVID has been tough on everybody. So it's a great point. You want to ask that, you know, how recent was the transaction? So we had a question that's come in from Gerald, and he says, are HOAs renegotiating vendor contracts in light of COVID? and the loss of revenues and higher costs. For instance, if you have a 3-year landscaping contract with an annual escalation, is renegotiating a reasonable strategy to keep costs down? I was going to answer sort of tongue-in-cheek in that, renegotiating is always a good strategy, perhaps, right? You want to be a good partner with your vendors, and certainly you want to look at the terms of the contract that you have. And, based on the history and your partnership with that vendor, I think that's certainly a strategy you could look at, but you'd want to check with your association attorney regarding the actual contract, and again, look at the history with that vendor and what relationship you have with them.
Yeah.
Another question that came in. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's a very good point. And you can also check, like almost every contract that's needed for a community there are experts in the field that can help you review those contracts, because similar to Fiona's thinking around whether or not to use contract negotiation as a savings tactic, you do want to make sure that you keep your good vendors, and they may not be able to renegotiate that contract substantially enough to make a difference. But there's almost always room in the set contracts for negotiation with at least 1 or 2 vendors. So if it's an area that the board doesn't know enough about or the manager doesn't know enough about, oftentimes there are consultants that are willing to help, and they're not very expensive. In some areas, like technology, for instance, there are consultants that are willing to help at no cost, essentially, to the association. So always look for expert knowledge when you're reviewing these contracts, or when you're doing a proposal too, frankly.
Yeah, that's a great point. And sort of our standard practice is, from a capital standpoint, is at budget time, right? So we're about to come into budget season. We've started at capital. Budget season, believe it or not, starts at the end of May. And so we have all the managers, looking at all of their contracts and, what are the escalation clauses? What are the termination dates? How happy are we with the vendor, service overall, et cetera, et cetera. So those are a good time to sit down with your manager and ask those questions. Let's see, we've got another question that came in from Joanne. She says, what is the charge to the vendor for vendor smart service, and is the association charged?
So we don't charge the association or the vendor for vetting services, which is essentially the service we provide to the association and or the management company. We don't charge any party for the vetting of that vendor. We do that at no cost. The way that we make money is from finding vendors jobs, essentially. So we're a lead system, a lead feeder to the vendors, and there are vendors that want to pay for that, and they do, and there are vendors that don't, and they don't. So in our system, there are a percentage of vendors that don't pay, and they're still in the system, and you'll still be able to find them, and you'll still find them as vetted. They'll be compliant or not compliant. Like, it depends on what you're looking for. So I hope that answered the question, although not so concisely.
Yeah, that's okay. So I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions. So a question came in from Elizabeth, and she's saying, what platform is suggested for review of a vendor? Angie's List, Yelp. We've got another one that says, what is the best way to find a vendor? So maybe if you guys could give your thoughts on that a little bit.
Yeah, so let me take it first, Matt. So the Angie's List is a great solution if you're looking for a residential project. So for like replacing the windows on your home or redoing the roof on your home. But when you're looking for commercial vendors, none of those guys tend to do a good job of first having a curated list of vendors that are commercially minded, and second, they don't do a good job of vetting the vendors to make sure that they have the proper insurance and the proper licensing that you'll need as an organization. So they are a good place to look if you're looking for smaller projects and things like that, but you're not going to find the right vendor for most projects that you do in a commercial setting.
Yeah, so to that point, there are several online resources that you can use. I'm biased, obviously, so I'm always going to go with VendorSmart first. But to Alex's point about having commercially minded vendors, one of the benefits of VendorSmart is that we have curated a list of vendors who work at who do commercial work at properties, at homeowners associations and condo buildings across the country. So that's one of the biggest benefits, I would say, with utilizing a free service like VendorSmart, is that these guys have already been vetted. They're used to working on properties where, there may be vendors on Angie's List or Yelp or Google that may be great vendors, but they're not used to working at the commercial level. So in addition to that, VendorSmart, the way we do our review process is unique. So VendorSmart is not an open platform like a Yelp or a Google. And the only way you can actually leave reviews for vendors on VendorSmart is if your username is tied to a management company. So what that does is it weeds out all of the people that come from the internet and that may want to leave a review or a phony review even, because they can't unless they're tied, their email address is tied to like a Castle Group or another management company. So the reviews that you and the managers are reading about the vendors on VendorSmart are genuine, because we've built a mechanism that doesn't allow for people just coming from the internet and leaving phony reviews, where you may get that on a Google or a Yelp, not all the time, but you will see reviews that are, maybe not genuine. So that's one of the biggest benefits of using a VendorSmart or a company like us, is that the list is already curated for these types of vendors, and then the reviews, what you're reading, is genuine, and there are steps in place to prevent that.
Yeah, and I can kind of add to that too. Oh, sorry, Alex. I was just going to say, we often get, a board member who will say, hey, I've used this vendor, myself, and I think they would do a great job. They put in a pool for me in my backyard. I think they'd be, great to, redo the pool for the association, for example. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But from a management standpoint, again, I think the point is there may be a difference between someone doing a small residential, pool versus a large scale pool. The jobs could be, the scale of the jobs are different. And so that's where your management company comes in, in helping vet that and determine whether or not the person or the vendor can handle the scale and the scope of the job. Just like, not all electricians are created equal, not all doctors are created equal, not all vendors are created equal, right? So they may do great mowing your lawn, but they may not be able to mow, 17 acres, on a regular basis kind of thing. So those are all things to consider. And sorry, Alex, I interrupted you.
No, that was a good point. There was another question I think that came in that was something very specific to this. So that there's a vendor that might have been a bit too small for a job, and COVID is now essentially hurting them. So things like the pandemic can affect a smaller vendor who maybe was in that nebulous area of they're able to do the job, but if something happens, they're no longer able to do the job because they lost 10% of their staff or something to that effect. And so those are things that you want to keep in mind when you're selecting these vendors as well.
Also, job capacity.
Go ahead, Matt.
Sorry, just also job capacity, right? Sometimes you see with some of the smaller or residential vendors, they've got 3 projects that they're working on, but if you give them a 4th, then all of a sudden the quality slips, right? Because they're not built to handle another project, right? They'll tap out. And that can happen with larger vendors as well. It just happens at a much higher job capacity rate. So that's one thing that we often don't think of when hiring vendors is how many projects are you working on right now? And can you handle another project at this scale? Or is it just going to, is the quality going to reduce because you're not built right now to handle that? So I think that's a big differentiator between a commercial vendor and, maybe a residential vendor that works on smaller pools is can they actually handle an additional project or 2 or 3 before the quality starts being reduced?
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect segue. One of the questions that came in was, and again, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but the question is, so we've put together the RFP, we've gone out to bid, we got, 4 bid packages in, we've opened those bid packages, at a noticed meeting, a committee meeting it could be, we've gone through them, we've narrowed it down, we've listened to presentations, we've now got, our top 2 or even top one, vendor. And the question basically is, can we then, start to negotiate with that vendor for terms, et cetera, that may be different perhaps than what was in the bid. And so typically when you do a bid, you're putting in the RFP, you're putting in, the basics, the scope of the project. So I'm going to use an example. You might say something like, we want the project to be completed in 45 days. And as in the process of your meetings, you discover that 45 days isn't realistic. Maybe it needs to be 60 days. So yeah, absolutely. Once you start to have those conversations, you can make those changes. My only caution is you don't want to say the RFP was for a volleyball court, and through the course of negotiations, you're now building a tennis court. That you don't want to do. That would be a scrap the RFP, let's start over, right? Because there's all sorts of transparency issues, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's within the scope of the job and it's reasonable, you have to look for that reasonableness rule. Absolutely, you can, because all of these questions we're talking about are great questions, and you may be going down, the line with one particular vendor, and then you realize, oh my gosh, we've got a deal breaker, right? The vendor wants, doesn't want to start for 6 months because he's already got so many jobs, he or she, and we need them to start next month. So even though this was our first choice, we're going to have to now go to choice number 2 or choice number 3 or whatever it might be. So for sure, you can have those bumps in the road come along, and you have to adjust as they come.
And one key point when you're negotiating these projects is to have one voice, right? So you want to make sure you elect, for lack of a better word, one person who's going to communicate with the vendor. You and the entire committee behind the scenes can have conversations and set what the expectations are, and all those things are true. But if you have multiple people talking to the vendor, there will be substantial losses to translation. So you'll want one message sender. In the end, you'll want one negotiator, and that should be the person that's best at negotiating. But it's very, very important to not have multiple conversations with a vendor, with multiple people on it.
So we had a question come in from Barry, and he says, he's asking, are you seeing more properties looking at technology now more than in the past with COVID? For example, security, connectivity, et cetera, with more folks now working from home. Please comment about this. So I'll turn it over to you guys. What are you seeing?
Sure. So the biggest changes that we're seeing in communities today from a technology perspective are increased needs for video surveillance and increased needs for some form of bandwidth or cellular service. So with having to monitor the common areas to make sure that there aren't as many people in the pool areas as the mandates require, communities are investing in digital camera systems that will allow management and or security to keep enforcing those rules. In addition, with everyone working from home, this is particularly important in a condo. Matt is actually experiencing some of this in his place right now. The bandwidth requirements that existed for the number of residents that you have 6 months ago are nowhere near what they are today. So whereas before a provider of internet services had, let's say, the capacity to do 300 concurrent connections at any given point, today there might be 600 because everyone's working from home. Everyone's using the internet at that condo or in the clubhouse or wherever it is. And so what we are seeing a lot of then is renegotiating of those agreements to increase bandwidth requirements, or renegotiate bulk agreements to increase the bandwidth per household for those that have internet included. That's one of the areas where expert knowledge helps substantially. It's a very difficult thing to understand how much bandwidth you really need and how much you should pay for that bandwidth without having industry knowledge there. So there are services that can help you negotiate those contracts, and often those services are free, frankly, to the association.
Yeah, and we can help you find those services, by the way. So if anybody is interested in that, please contact us. We'll put up our contact information, and we can connect you to the right people that can help you with those types of things.
Sure.
Okay. We had a question that came in, and it said, COVID has affected our landscape vendor. How much pressure can we put on this vendor who's not fulfilling the contract? And before I answer that one, I had another one come in that was sort of similar. So there's a couple of questions that are all sort of grouped in together, and it's basically about vendors not performing to the contract. And so for sure, when you have that happen, there's a couple of things you want to do. One is document, right? Specifically, what does the contract say the service is, whether it's landscaping or whether it's a construction project, it doesn't matter. What does the contract say the service the vendor is going to provide? And what is the issue? So they haven't arrived on time. Maybe the contract says there's no work on Saturdays and they've shown up on a Saturday. Or they're supposed to, be on property 3 days a week and you haven't seen them other than 1 day a week for the last 6 weeks, right? So you want to document specifically. You want to get your association attorney involved because depending on the wording of the contract, some contracts have a right to cure period, which essentially means even if the vendor has done something wrong, you have to give them the opportunity to cure that issue, and you have to notice them in a specific manner. So that's why it is so important with every contract that the association enters into. Castle's guidance is always have your association attorney review it, including the Castle contract, right? We don't want anyone to sign a contract with Castle without it going to their association's attorney. So you want to get your association attorney involved. You want to document. You want to communicate, right, with the vendor. Hey, what's going on? That goes back to our very first point of vendor relationships. You may think it's obvious that the vendor knows that you're upset, but, don't assume anything. Assume the best out of everybody and say, hey, we need to have a meeting. And I would suggest that meeting would be your property manager, the vendor who's on the property doing the work, and whoever that supervisor is. So in this instance, it's a landscaping as the example. You probably have a crew that works on your property on a regular basis, but that crew has a supervisor. You want that supervisor in that meeting. And the more specific examples you can give, the more productive that meeting will be. And then you want to make sure there's clear expectations moving forward. And if there is a cure period, clear metrics to hit that cure period, because the goal for everybody is you want good service and the vendor wants to keep the contract, right? So you want to make sure it's just crystal clear moving forward.
Sure. By the way, if you have an account manager for that service or a salesperson that you work with regularly, you want to include that person in that grievance meeting as well.
Okay. And we have another question. It says, do condo owners typically get paid as a vendor for doing a repair job? So I think what they're asking is maybe like an actual owner living on property who's doing work for the association and getting paid for it. And our guidance would be, we do see that from time to time, but we treat every vendor the same. So if they're doing work for the association, they would be considered a vendor and would need to meet the same standard as any other vendor if they're getting paid for it, if that makes sense. Another question is, what if a vendor disappears and leaves behind debris? The vendor does not respond to inquiries to dispose of the debris. So again, this would be one where you want to look at the verbiage in your contract. My assumption is based on the question that it says in the contract that they're going to remove the debris. So you want to document, picture is worth 1,000 words, certified letter, get the association's attorney involved. And if you haven't, hopefully paid paid for the job yet, you can hold back to get, my suggestion would be get the debris out of there, document the cost to do that, and hold that back from the final invoice, but make sure you check with your association attorney first.
Yeah, documentation of expectations, guys, is paramount for getting what you want in the end. Whether it's a larger project and you need an actual agreement with attorneys involved, or a light bulb changed, which doesn't require that likely. But you should always, in writing, set the expectations, even if it's in an email to the vendor. I need you to replace this light bulb with this, and I need it done by this time. And if the vendor meets those criteria, they did a great job, and if they didn't, they didn't. But there's a clear success criteria that's set up front so that no party has a misunderstanding.
So I'm going to kind of paraphrase a couple of questions here that have been typed in. So it's talking about the level of insurance that a vendor would need to do work, specifically this one is saying in a condo. But Matt or Alex, can you kind of speak to that as far as when you're vetting the vendor? Sure. Kind of elaborate a little bit more.
So it depends. You'll want to check with your association's insurance agent to see what you guys are covered for and what they recommend. You may also want to check with your attorney because it really depends on the condo and what type of insurance they have and those things. But things to look out for are condo exclusions. Like there are plenty of vendors who have liability insurance with an exclusion to work on condos. So if anything happened in a condo building, they wouldn't cover that job. And that's not something that's always seen in the certificate of insurance, which is the document that essentially the vendor provides for proof of insurance, right? So you always want to ask the insurance agent if there are any exclusions. So keep it general because there could be additional exclusions, like they can work in a condo, but they can't work in a pool at a condo. So that's one thing that you want to check for certain. The average limits are limits are not something that you want to standardize for sure, because you might have a $500 job that has a different limits need than a $40 million construction project, right? So for that $40 million construction project, you're going to want a policy specific to that project, which is going to be a lot more than a $1 million, $2 million standard liability project, right? But the short answer is that the average vendor is okay with a $2 million lifetime, $1 million per occurrence policy, and that's what we see generally asked for in the industry. You'll definitely want to check with your insurance agent and your attorney though before making that decision.
Yeah, and the audience, you guys will notice we're often saying, you know, consult your attorney, and we don't mean to run up your legal bill, but there are definite times and places to you know, huddle up with the association attorney. And anytime you're doing a large scale project where there's, you know, some risk involved, for sure, you know, a little bit of money spent up front will save everybody a lot of headaches and, you know, damage and, you know, money in the end, at the end of the day. So it's money well spent.
Especially if you want to work with someone that may not be carrying a specific type of insurance that is recommended. Like for instance, if you're working with a smaller vendor that may not need workers' comp insurance because of their size, if an employee gets hurt, they're still going to need some money from somebody. And if there's no workers' comp insurance at the vendor side, they're going to come looking for it somewhere else. So it's always good to check with attorney when it comes to those kinds of things, when you're going to go outside of the normal practices, for sure.
We had a question about how do you avoid fraud and kickbacks with vendor contracts? So part of the reason why you want to get bids from multiple sources is for that reason, to make sure, right, that not only that you're paying the right amount, but that you're not just funneling everything to the same, you know, group of vendors. We also have some internal best practices as far as, you know, from a property management standpoint, right? So making sure we're always interviewing different vendors, introducing different vendors. We do a lot of education with our property managers about the different vendors that are in the market. And we're always welcoming new vendors. It's actually a big question that we get when we bring on a new association. They say, you know, do we have to use sort of your vendors? And there's no such thing as our vendors, right? Everyone's given the same opportunity. So those are some, you know, protocols that you can kind of put in place. But bidding out and having an RFP really makes it so that everyone's on sort of the same playing field. Another thing, depending on, again, the size of the project, is to put right in the RFP that you're going to do sort of tours or property tours for the vendors. So one aspect is you bring all the vendors in at the same time. You can say it's, you know, Friday the 27th at 1 p.m. All the vendors are going to come that are going to intend to bid on the project, and the property manager and maybe a committee member or a board member would be involved, You'd walk through the project with them. They can all ask, the vendors can all ask the questions out in the open. You try to keep it a fair playing field so that if a vendor does, ask a question after the fact, I know when I've gone out on property walks as a vendor hoping to get someone's business, I'll ask a question and they'll say, oh, no one's asked that. Just so you know, Fiona, we're going to now email that to everybody we're going to email the question and the answer to everybody who's bidding. And I think that's great. So those types of things can help alleviate some of that. I know, Matt or Alex, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, so if there's a specific situation where you don't trust the party negotiating the agreement for some reason, probably that's not the right party to negotiate the agreement. But aside from that, you can ask for a third party vetting of that process. So there are, again, industry experts that can help you through a proposal process that provide almost an agnostic view of the project. They'll tell you this is the right vendor because of this and this. The vendor that you were choosing was not it, even though they were cheaper, whatever it was. But they provide another set of eyes that you may not have the same mistrust over.
Great point. And on some of the really large construction projects, you often have an engineer, for example, who will help you as the manager, help you with the RFP, things like that. So they can also bring a wealth of knowledge to that process. We had a question that came in from Denny, and he says, what happens if a property manager brings in a vendor who's not licensed and insured? Is the HOA at risk, or the management company who misled the HOA? So that's kind of a loaded question, but I'm going to give you the sort of the standard answer saying, yeah, for sure, if you have that scenario, that's a prime example, Denny, of where you want to get the association's attorney involved and, walk through that scenario so you can get some true guidance on that. And it kind of goes back to, for your association, what is the standard practice for even vetting a vendor in the first place, right? So how did they even get on property to do work if that wasn't documented? Part of the way that we work with Vendor Smart is we can't pay anybody unless we've got them, through the license and the insurance. So that's kind of the catch-all, and the vendors know that. So they know they have to get their information in, and they have to be completely cleared through the system because we won't be able to cut them a check unless we've got the check-all from Vendor Smart. So we're just about out of time. Alex and Matt, anything to add? The hour went by quick.
Yeah, it did. No,
go
ahead, Matt, sorry.
I just want to add one more thing. So I know we've been talking a lot about quality of work and how to hire a vendor, and we briefly touched on reviews and references. I just want to give a couple of points on what you should be looking for when you're hiring a new vendor, when you're reading reviews, right? In addition to everything that we've talked about. So I would say just quickly, there's probably three things. So when you're reading reviews about a vendor, when you're asking for references, first thing I would want to know is what is the story, right? Like, what did the vendor do? If I'm reading a review, I want to read a story. It doesn't really help anyone to read the vendor was great or the vendor was not great, right? Like that doesn't tell you anything. So what I'm looking for is what happened, right? So I had a leak. The vendor came in and assessed it. They fixed the leak. They put protocols in place to prevent the leak from happening again, right? Like that gives me a full picture of what that vendor did and what they're capable of. And it's a lot more helpful to me to make a decision rather than just reading they were great. So that's the first thing that I'm looking for is what's the story. The second, and this is super important, we don't talk about it nearly enough as we should, but is the vendor a good partner, right? So we've spent a lot of time talking about quality of work. But I also think that the quality of the partnership is just as important. So the vendor may be great at fixing leaks, but if they don't answer their phone, then they're not a good partner. Right? If they don't show up on time, they're not a good partner. If they don't call you after the fact to make sure that the job was completed to your satisfaction, they're not a good partner, right? So making sure that the vendor is not just good at the work, but a good partner as well is super critical and something that I look for personally, and I think that you should be looking for as well. So not just quality of work, quality of partnership. And then lastly, and probably the most important is, would the manager hire the vendor again? right? Like that's an easy way of knowing whether or not the vendor did a good job or not. We want to dig for more, but at the end of the day, if I'm a manager, would I hire that vendor again or not? So those are probably the three things that I would look for when hiring a vendor and reading reviews is what's the story and how did the vendor fix it? Is the vendor a good partner, and would that vendor be hired again? And I just wanted to touch on those things because we talked a lot about the quality of work, but the quality of the other things that are a little bit more abstract are just as important in my opinion.
I'm just going to say thank you for your time, guys. Fee, as always, great talking and seeing you. And everybody stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. Alex and Matt, and to our audience, thank you very much. This presentation, you'll be able to log on to Castle Group /webinars, and you'll be able to see it. I had somebody send in a note saying they were having some Wi-Fi trouble. So yes, you'll be able to see the entire recording there probably by tomorrow. And if you have any other questions, or if we didn't get to your question, feel free to email us info@castlegroup.com. And our team will follow up with any specific questions that you may have that did not get answered. So thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate your time. Stay safe out there, be kind to each other, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys.